Well, if you've seen my more recent video about 2816's trip down to Mexico, in it I mentioned possibly the idea of making a whole video just about 2816's history, like a fool. And as such, I have gotten multiple requests for this, and okay, sure. Yeah, let's do that. Canadian Pacific 2816 is a preserved steam locomotive, an H1b 464 Hudson, built by the Montreal Locomotive Works in December of 1930. She was one of 10 immediate sisters, the H1bs, that were numbered 2810 through 2819. The H in the designation referred to the wheel arrangement, so Hudson, yeah, we got that. The 1 was the design number, and the B meant that she was part of the second production run. She was initially assigned to the premier passenger service that was running on Canadian Pacific between Winnipeg and Fort William, Ontario. However, towards the end of the decade, in 1937, the semi-streamlined Royal Hudsons came into service. These were, well, streamlined, fancy. And as such, 2816 was reassigned to secondary duties between Windsor, Ontario, and Quebec City. She would still be in service until the 50s, pulling commuter trains, even receiving a minor overhaul in 1957, with her tender being replaced with one that was taken from a Royal Hudson, 2822. But she would eventually be retired on May 26, 1960. During her career, she actually accumulated 2,046,000 miles. And even though she wasn't used to pull trains anymore, she was still utilized for a short time as a stationary boiler at the St. Luc Yards in Montreal. Around the same time, a man named F. Nelson Blount was looking to expand his own collection, known as Steamtown, USA. He had a lot of steam locomotives, and he wanted to preserve them. But one item that was missing from his collection that he really wanted was a Hudson, but from the New York Central Railroad. Now, as I've gone over numerous times, there are no New York Central Hudsons left. By the time Blount was looking into it, they were already gone, leaving him with little other option than to compromise and find a different Hudson, not from New York Central, but of the same wheel arrangement. And he was able to acquire 2816 from Canadian Pacific in December of 1963. She had been sitting in the scrap lines at the time, so this was a very last-minute save to keep her from being destroyed, and she would be placed with the rest of the collection on static display at Steamtown's first location, located in Bellows Falls, Vermont. Now, Steamtown, well, it had good intentions, has a rocky history in and of itself. For one thing, especially back then, most of the exhibits were outdoors, and as such, 2816 suffered from exposure to the elements. She would eventually be moved during the winter of 1983 and 1984, along with the rest of the collection, to the current location of the Steamtown collection in Scranton, Pennsylvania. Steamtown nowadays is reorganized as a Steamtown National Historic Site under the ownership of the National Park Service. Though interestingly, they didn't really have much of an interest in keeping 2816. They deemed her surplus, not really something they necessarily needed. So they wanted to get rid of her. Not scrap her, but they wanted to send her somewhere else. Concurrently, during the mid-1990s, the then president and CEO of CPR, named Robert Ritchie, had reorganized the company and wound up establishing the Royal Canadian Pacific Excursion Train to honor the railway's history. He personally pushed for them to operate their own steam excursion program, but they didn't have any steam locomotives themselves. Staff at Steamtown had actually already reached out to BC Rail, offering to sell 2816 to them since they were running their own steam excursion program at the time, using Royal Hudson 2860. BC Rail had only been looking for replacement parts for 2860, but Steamtown wanted them to take the whole locomotive. When Canadian Pacific management found out about this, they extended an offer to Steamtown because they wanted the locomotive intact, and they sent a team to look her over to make sure that she was actually worth buying, see what her condition was like. At the time, they felt she looked good, so in 1998, Canadian Pacific purchased 2816 from Steamtown. Then she traveled cross-country over to the BC Rail's steam workshop in North Vancouver, British Columbia. The reason for this is that, as I said, BC Rail was already operating their own steam program, and they had staff on their payroll that were working on a steam locomotive. They had skilled personnel in order to restore one. So Canadian Pacific contracted BC Rail to do the restoration of 2816. The crew was led by Al Broadfoot, and they did a more thorough inspection of 2816, completely disassembling her to see exactly what kind of work she needed. The plan was set up in such a way that if she were deemed salvageable, she'd be restored to operating condition, but if she wasn't, they would just give her a cosmetic restoration for static display purposes. At no point was she in danger of being destroyed. It was discovered that she was actually in pretty bad shape, much worse than the inspectors had thought. She was mechanically completely worn out. But Robert Ritchie was very committed to what he had set out to do, and he believed 2816 should be restored. So regardless of how bad of a condition she was in, he approved the restoration. Broadfoot and his team set about working on her as soon as they were given the go-ahead. And they were able to obtain multiple plans, which included over 800 technical drawings that were provided by the Canada Science and Technology Museum of H1b class locomotives, since there were some key differences between 2816 and the Royal Hudson 2860. They weren't exactly the same. They had to fabricate hundreds of replacement parts via contractors in and around Vancouver. Her cab, running boards, rod brasses, her superheater manifold, as well as numerous other parts had to be completely remade. They also had to seek other contractors down in the United States for much more major components, including her driving wheels, which had to be sent to the Tennessee Valley Railroad Museum. And her boiler was actually sent to Doyle McCormick and his crews located in Portland, Oregon. During the process, they converted 2816 from coal to oil firing, and her tender was modified to receive dual water intakes with Canadian and American threads. Things actually went very smoothly despite how much work had to be done, so much so that Canadian Pacific announced on April 19, 2000, that they expected 2816 to return to service by September of that year, but that did not happen. They kind of jumped the gun on announcing that, as this sometimes occurs. There were further challenges that had to be overcome, and everything had to be pushed back to the following year. In all, the project took 2 years to finish, and cost the railway $2 million, which renders it one of the most expensive steam locomotive restoration projects ever carried out and completed in Canada. But they did do it. On August 15, 2001, 2816 passed her federal boiler inspection, and she was fired up for the first time in 40 years. They had her complete a few test runs over 3 days on Canadian Pacific's Cascade subdivision, and from September 19th to the 23rd, with Al Broadfoot as the fireman and Bill Stetler and Doyle McCormick taking turns as the engineer, she pulled her first official inaugural excursion out of Port Moody and toured across some of the main lines for a total of 672 miles over 5 days, before stopping off at Canadian Pacific's headquarters in Calgary, Alberta. Over the next decade, she would continue pulling excursions, and she'd earned the nickname the Empress. On May 16, 2002, she pulled 2 excursions for the West Coast Express. Between May 24th and July 8th of 2003, she toured between Alberta and Ontario. That specific tour had the purpose of spreading awareness of Canadian Pacific for advertising, as well as to raise money for the Children's Breakfast for Learning program. On September 27th, she visited the Kamloops Heritage Railway and took part in a double-header excursion with Canadian National number 2141. In May 2004, she pulled the Royal Canadian Pacific Consus while performing a 3,000-mile tour across the Canadian Pacific between Vancouver and Montreal. That particular excursion would mark the first time in 50 years that a single steam locomotive pulled a cross-country passenger train in Canada, though it's worth mentioning that she was assisted by 3 Heritage diesels. But it was still an awesome thing that happened. In early June 2004, Empress was actually ferried behind a Soo Line SD60 over the CSX main line between Buffalo, New York and Chicago, Illinois. And then she went to the Twin Cities area in Minnesota to participate in the Grand Excursion 2004 event, which was celebrating the 150th anniversary of the Chicago and Rock Island Railroad's celebration train of 1854. She pulled multiple different excursions for the event, with the last one taking place on July 3rd, which was a double-header, with Milwaukee Road 261. She would return from Minnesota to Calgary with a charity train later on in the month. In August of 2007, she toured the Canadian Pacific from Calgary to Chicago, and then pulled some public excursions within Illinois and Wisconsin, which included another doubleheader with 261 again. She returned to Calgary by the end of September, but at the end of the 2008 operating season, the Canadian Pacific Railway put the whole steam program on hold. This was due to financial issues they were running into that were mostly caused by the Great Recession that was going on at the time. As a result of this, 2816 didn't operate at all in 2009, but crews did take the time to perform some serious maintenance work on her, as well as the passenger car fleet. She would, in fact, return to service, fortunately, on June 6, 2010, when she pulled excursions to raise money for the Children's Wish Foundation. And she was also filmed with IMAX cameras for the Rocky Mountain Express, a 2011 film that observes the Empress on a journey from Vancouver to Montreal while going over Canadian Pacific's history. On June 11th, 2011, she did another excursion that promoted the Children's Wish Foundation, and she was scheduled to complete a tour on August 5th at Calgary, but midway through that she actually suffered mechanical issues, and she had to return for repairs. In late 2012 is when things really started to change. Robert Ritchie was no longer in charge at this point, but his successor Fred Green had also been supportive of the steam program, but he would step down, and a man named E. Hunter Harrison succeeded him. Harrison is a complicated individual. The CB Brass would eventually wind up accusing him of violating many of their confidentiality rules, and he only wound up in the position due to activist investor Bill Ackman undertaking a proxy battle with the board of directors of Canadian Pacific. But regardless of any of that, Harrison wasn't interested in continuing the steam locomotive operations at all. He felt that Canadian Pacific should be mostly focused on improving their finances and operation tactics. Why you can't do both of those things, I'm not 100% sure, but either way, the steam program was discontinued. This resulted in 2816's excursion operations to be halted entirely, and she was put into storage in Calgary. Fortunately, not in danger of being disposed of or anything like that. They wouldn't dare, but she wasn't going to be moved anytime soon. Harrison would eventually resign from the railway in early 2017 due to a lot of issues, and a man named Keith Creel succeeded him. But even under him, at least at first, 2816's excursion career wasn't restarted. On November 13th, 2020, however, they did fire her up briefly for a steam test, and she was moved around the Calgary yard just to assess her mechanical condition. And it was later announced that she would at least make a run as part of a filming of a holiday train video. But in 2021, things did change. For the better, again. Creel would announce that the United States Surface Transportation Board had approved of Canadian Pacific's merger with the Kansas City Southern, creating a brand new railway, Canadian Pacific Kansas City, CPKC, which formally became a thing in 2023. But in terms of how this relates to 2816, Creel felt that this sort of thing should be celebrated, and he announced the railway would do this by bringing 2816 back under steam to lead a tour all the way from Calgary to Mexico City, which would make her the first steam locomotive to run through Canada, the United States, and Mexico. But she was in need of an overhaul. But this was carried out relatively quickly, completed by June of 2023. She was tested that same month, and on July 11th she made a run from Calgary to Carseland and back as part of Shakedown. Further tests were performed in August, from Calgary to Colhurst, and back again. In October of 2023, two back-to-back runs from Calgary to Edmonton, then back again, then from Calgary to Medicine Hat, and back again, would eventually conclude the tests of 2816. She performed flawlessly. She was ready, and people were excited for the tour. It was going to be insanely long, and a great comeback for the Empress. 2024, she began the final Spike Steam Tour, running all the way from Calgary with whistle stops in Moose Jaw on April 28th, Minot, North Dakota on April 30th, St. Paul, Minnesota on May 3rd, Franklin Park, Illinois on May 8th, Davenport, Iowa on May 10th, Kansas City, Missouri on May 18th, Shreveport, Louisiana on May 24th, Laredo, Texas on May 28th, Monterrey, Nuevo Leon on May 31st, and Mexico City on June 7th. And mostly, the trip went very well, except when she got to Mexico. Now, I've already made a whole video about 2816 in Mexico, but needless to say, the railroad didn't really realize how big of a deal she would be down there, I think is a big part of the problem. People didn't understand proper etiquette, they were too excited, and it resulted in at least one woman dying by getting too close. Many got too close and had near misses. It was a complete mess, to the point that they had to call in armed guards to protect 2816. There have been stories of vandalism, and at least one of the deals that was with 2816 was graffitied. So, yeah, it wasn't a good look. And it actually is pretty upsetting because there are many honest, good-natured rail fans down in Mexico that are super upset about how their country handled this whole thing. It kind of ruined it for everybody, since some just don't think they should send steam locomotives down to Mexico anymore. I wish it didn't have to come to that. I feel like there's a better way. But yeah, it wasn't good. If you want to see my whole take on it, go watch that video. I'm not going to go into the detail about it again. At the same time, it did help drum up excitement for steam locomotive preservation. She was viewed by thousands in Mexico City. It was a really big deal. As much of a mess as it may have been, she was a crowd pleaser, to say the least. And she would depart for her return trip on June 9th. During her trip, she's going to make another whistle stop at Silvis, Illinois, Winnipeg on July 6th, and she's due to arrive back at Calgary in about a month from the date of this video, July 10th. Presumably, there will be no more major incidents in that time, we can hope, and the Empress stands as a unique piece. While there do exist 4 other sisters of hers, those are all the semi-streamlined Royal Hudsons. 2816 is the only survivor of the non-streamlined variants, and as of this year, she's the only operating Hudson in North America at all. None of her sisters are currently working, and there's no others. Any surviving Hudsons are all currently on static display. So, yeah, it's a pretty big deal that she's still running, and hopefully her career will continue without any more major incidents. And with that, a special thank you to all my underwater train finders, Some Dude 267, Orange Glass, Benjamin Owens, Anzac 81, Arthur Roy, Jack Carson's Railroad Videos, Lord Off 444, Isurfer 1405, Charles Kwiatkowski, Matt Weaver, Tom Redline, NS Productions 8104, Wheeljack 8401, Rescues Greyhounds, The Baxter, Caleb Crosswhite, Andrew Bowen, Josh Johnson, Caleb Brainwaters, Perez Drenton, Master of None, Travis Solinsky, Jared Brussel, JBL Explorers, Tommy Rossini, Ben McCullough, Panzer Kitson 131-232, Mark Holding, G Wiz, Mr. Revel, Hayden DeGrow, Metal for Life Guy, No, Kurt Forkham, Ohio Trucker 1, Mitchell Cole, Mr. Sleepy, Dr. Racer 78, AET Museum, Railroad Preserver 2000, Williard Conklin, Windy City Rails, DM Travel Typhoon, Harry, Hannah Bird, Western Colorado History, Ryan Wehofer, Drew Debris, George Kenny, Murder Drone Stall, Kevin Wood, Liam Wright, Morris Hillman Productions, NJ 1969, Hendrick Motorsports Fan 5, and of course, my dad. Till next time, this is Darkness, and I bid you all a fond farewell.